Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to complete the second lecture for today or for this week. So we talked about pretrial identifications in the previous video lecture. So now we're going to talk about the second part of identifications, which is going to be forensics identifications. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint. Okay. So when we're talking about pretrial identifications, you'll remember that we said that there's two different types of pretrial identifications. There could be eyewitness identifications, and that's what we spent the last lecture talking about. And then we are going to now talk about the forensic science investigations. Okay, so that's the one we're going to focus on and how we use forensics to identify suspects. So when I say forensic evidence, what types of evidence do you think I'm talking about? So what do I mean by forensics? Well, it could be fingerprinting, it could be a voice sample, it could be a handwriting sample, it could be ballistics, comparing bullets and shell casings, it could be fibers, it could be fingerprints and DNA. So all of those things are what we call forensic evidence. And so we're going to talk about how procedurally we get to admit that in court as evidence to help identify a suspect. Okay. So what do police do to collect this forensic evidence? So we have to think at first when they're getting the evidence and collecting the evidence, what are the procedures? It's everything that we've talked about in the class so far. So search and seizure and warrants and all of that good stuff. That's all the procedures for collecting the evidence. We've already talked all about that when we talked about searches and seizures. But now we need to take it to the part of how do we get it into trial. So Joey Junkie's arrested for selling drugs. It was believed that the police believed by the police that right before he was arrested, he swallowed 3 caplets of drugs. The police decided to take him to the hospital and pump his stomach to remove the drugs. Joey Junkie protests, but the procedure occurs. At trial, he seeks to suppress the evidence since it was unreasonable searches and seizures. So just as a review, when they're collecting physical or forensic evidence from a person under the search and seizure rules, we talked about this. Would this procedurally be okay for collecting evidence? And remember, we talked about the shock of the conscience of the court test. So when police are gathering this evidence, the search and seizure procedures that we talked about, remember, they cannot use any procedures that would be shocking to the court. So just remember that process when you're talking about collection of physical evidence from people. And remember, it's a case-by-case determination by the court. Now, so we have all the evidence, we've collected all the evidence, we're ready to go. We want to go to court. So how does a lawyer present that scientific evidence to the jury? Do they just walk in on a table and dump everything and say, okay, jury, come and look at it. This is what I have. How do they get the jury to start considering that evidence? How do we get it admitted at the trial? Well, this is done through what we call expert witnesses. So you need an expert witness to testify about that evidence. So that's where forensic experts come into play. They may be the ones doing the scientific testing in the lab, but they're going to have to come to court and testify based on their expertise. They're going to have to be witnesses at the trial, expert witnesses. So then we have to ask ourselves, can we call any expert on anything? Can we call in a fellow student to be an expert on skid marks, or can we call a fellow student to be an expert on DNA? What do we have to do to get the expert to be able to testify in court? And can they talk about just any subject that they want? And so the court had to decide this, how are we going to figure out which experts are going to be permitted and which ones would not be permitted? So the courts came up with what's called the admissibility of scientific evidence tests. And there's 2 tests that we're going to talk about. So you have to know which test applies to your jurisdiction. And then you would have to fit that test before the judge would allow that expert to testify at court. So the first test I want to talk about is what we call the Fry test. And this was a court case, US versus Fry. And actually, this case had to do with polygraph lie detector tests. And the court had to determine whether or not they're going to allow lie detector tests as evidence. Now, we don't necessarily, and they said no, but we don't necessarily care about what the scientific evidence is. We want to know what the test is that the court is requiring to pass if you want to get this evidence in. And so what they did is they created what's called the Fry test. To pass the Fry test, to get the evidence in front of the jury, the attorney that wants to present it has to convince the jury, the judge first, of two things. First, that they need an expert to explain, because it's a complicated procedure, complicated concepts, right? So that the jury couldn't just figure it out by themselves. A common person wouldn't understand. You need this expert to explain it because it's a complicated thing, and we need somebody to explain it. So that's usually pretty easy to get through. But the second part is you have to prove that the scientific evidence that you want to show the jury is generally accepted among scientists in the field. That means if there's 100 scientists in the field, that 99% of them agree that this is proper and accurate science, that it's good science. Now, today's time, it's hard to get anybody to agree on anything, right? So this is a pretty hard test to satisfy. You have to show that it's really accepted in society, it's accepted as evidence by scientists, and it's a pretty high standard to get over. And polygraphs did not get over this. That's why you can't introduce lie detector tests at court. To make it a little easier, the courts in the federal system decided they thought that the test should be a little easier. We want a little more scientific evidence to be able to get in. So then this court case, Daubert versus Merrill Dow, came, and this was actually a civil case, and they were talking about admitting like drug evidence to you, whether certain drugs cause certain things to happen. But again, we don't care about what the evidence is so much. What we really care about is what's the test to determine if the expert can testify. So the first part is the same for the Daubert test. It has to be necessary for the jury to understand something complicated. You need an expert to testify. But they made the second part a lot easier. So instead of being generally accepted by scientists, they said that you just have to prove that it's relevant and reliable. So that's a much easier standard than trying to get a bunch of scientists to all agree that it's accepted science. So like under Fry, like people could argue that global warming doesn't pass because we don't have general acceptance in the field that global warming is, which we kind of do, but that's one of the arguments. But under Daubert, you definitely could, because all you have to show is that it's relevant to the case and it's generally reliable evidence, meaning you can reproduce the results. Other scientists could do the result test and they could get similar results. So a lot more types of forensic evidence is going to be admissible under this Daubert test than was permitted under Fry. Now in New York, we still use Fry. So New York's pretty limited in the types of forensic evidence that can be presented as evidence at trial, because you have to pass this Fry test if you want to get it admitted. So let's look at some examples together. So what about a bullet trajectory or bullet matching? Could we say that that's generally accepted under the Fry test? Do most scientists think that we can determine bullet trajectory or bullet matching? And under Fry, I would say, yeah, it's probably generally accepted. Okay. Now they're going to put a lot of scrutiny on who the expert is, how much training that person has. Are they truly an expert in the field? But they probably would allow it. Under Daubert, probably definitely, because if it's in Fry, it's definitely in under Daubert, because Daubert is the easier of the two tests. Okay. Now let's think about one more just for fun. We just were talking in the last lecture about pre-trial identifications and the reliability. And right now they haven't excluded this. So there's no real set answer yet to this. But if you apply these tests to what we talked about under Fry, do you think it would be generally accepted that eyewitness identifications are reliable forms of evidence? I'm not so sure under Fry. It could be a strong argument. Under Daubert, probably you could get that evidence in a little easier. Okay, so what about this? Police arrive at a crime scene and locate 3 separate areas of blood containing blood. When they collect the blood at the scene, they place all 3 or each sample into different vials using separate collection utensils. Once in the lab, the scientists have to test the blood for DNA, and the lab technician uses the same swab for all samples. So this is the issue now. Once you get the evidence in, if you can get it past the judge and the judge says, yes, you can talk about it, either under the Fry test or the Dauber test, the next main issue that has to be discussed is the accuracy of the testing. So they're going to go after how the test was conducted. So if it's the party that doesn't want the evidence, they're going to say that the scientists did it wrong, that they contaminated the evidence, that they used the wrong procedures. So if they can't argue that it's bad science and keep it out, then they're going to go after the people who performed the test and say that the test was performed poorly. And that's the second way that they can try to challenge this evidence in court. Okay, so just to get you thinking about it, if you were the judge, would you allow this types of evidence? Okay, so DNA. Do you think DNA would be allowed under Fry and under Dauber? Probably. Okay, what about fingerprints? Well, right now, yes, under both, they are permitted. There has been some questioning about fingerprints and how accurate they are, but yes, right now they're both accepted. What about voice wavelength analysis? So our voice can change wavelengths when we're lying. Is that scientifically acceptable? Definitely not under Fry yet. Maybe under Dauber. It would be a stretch. Okay. What about scent evidence? Can they suck the scent out of a trunk and detect that it's decaying humans? Definitely not under Fry. Some cases have tried to do this, so some states have allowed it under Dauber, but this would not be generally accepted at this point. Handwriting comparisons, very suspect under Fry. Probably not a lot of support under Fry, maybe under Dauber. Hair analysis. Hair analysis has come under a lot of scrutiny, definitely not under Fry. Under Dauber, they have allowed to testify that there's similarities, or no, they're not even allowed to say similarities anymore. They can say it's consistent with a person's hair, but that's it. You can't go any further. Fire origin, so you have an arson, the tracking of where that fire started is still skeptical in a lot of cases. So Fry, maybe not, maybe Dauber. And then tool markings, possibly under both. Okay, so that's the kind of analysis you have to do to determine whether or not that evidence would be permitted at trial. So nice and short, this section. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of what forensic evidence is accepted. And if you have any questions, let me know. So we are now done with all of the police procedure things. So after you're done with this lecture, you're ready for exam number 3. Exam number 3 is stop, question, frisk, arrest, pretrial interrogations, and pretrial identifications. So chapters 4, 5, 8, and 9. Okay, so make sure you look all of that over, make sure you have all your flow charts and that you're ready to roll, and then you can take exam 3. So I will see you next week. We will finally move away from police procedure and we'll start talking about the court procedures. See you soon.